Hello everybody. Today we're going to talk about the history of the Elder Scrolls, Daggerfall, Arena, and what came later, and why things weren't quite as clear cut as you might believe, and the success or failure of those games had nothing to do with Bethesda. So let's get into that, shall we? First, we had to go back to the 80s when RPGs were first created, and they were talking about frame by frame games. You move forward a square, the enemy moved forward a square. You clicked on a face, it hit things with a sword. Right? These were the games being developed at the time, and there were lots of them. There was also shooter games being developed at the time, like Driller, like Mercenaries. Not MechWarrior, it's a different kind of cheese, this Mercenaries. Right? It's a really good game, set in a world where you crashed on a planet and you had to rebuild your ship by completing tasks and doing things. But this was all the same technology, from the dungeons to Mercenaries to Drill. It was the same technology doing the same way. And they were really good games. People enjoyed them. And the pressure to make a full 3D game was on already. A first-person shooter game was on. However, that didn't come for another eight years, roughly. So these games were a chance to develop and mature. I mean, you don't get me wrong, you did get flight sims at the time that were full 3D. But these were very primitive line drawings, flying around like that. But anyway, about 91, Eye of the Beholder came out, and there was a few sequels to it, but that was a game people talked about. It was an RPG game everybody liked. Black Crypt on the Amiga was another game that everybody liked and talked about. And then you had Isha, a game that basically, if it was made today in a 3D world, you could have called it The Elder Scrolls Isha. If they'd continued making it in 3D and put the money and time into it, it would have been an Elder Scrolls beta. Because back then, for what it was, it beat the pants out of Arena and Daggerfall. And that was in 1992. And that, as in Arena, wasn't going to come along for another 2 years. Daggerfall wasn't going to come along for another 5 years. So they were way behind what was expected at the time. Trouble is, something happened, right, about in the early 90s. Which gave rise to the 3D shooters, like Quake, Doom, Unreal. And these dominated the market back then. These were the reasons Bethesda struggled to get into the market, because people were producing fantastic shoot 'em up games. Quake 1 to all up to 2, 3, whatever. It says Doom the same. It says Unreal. They owned the market when they started coming out. And Voodoo cards, you had a Voodoo card, you had a 16-bit graphics. This is why I always say people talk about frames per second on cards being the most important thing instead of image quality. Matrox, I think it was, did one that was a 24-bit, whereas Voodoo was 16-bit. But that's beside the point anyway. But the shooters made their splash. They immediately transitioned into a classic game. It was almost like the two 3D worlds of shooters were made for each other. Then they tried to mix in the 3D world with RPG game, and it didn't quite work. You had Hexen, which basically became a shooter with magic. It wasn't really an RPG in the sense that we'd had back with Eye of the Beholder or the Black Crypt or Isha. So when Daggerfall came out, it tried to make it work as an RPG. It used procedurally generated worlds, and that was very common in the 80s and early 90s, right? But by 96, that idea was dying on its feet. People were expecting more detail. The 3D worlds were starting to be made in the Morrowind style. You made the whole world, and then you entered it. There was no procedurally generated anymore. Everything had to be in the game. Games rapidly increased in size. CD-ROMs started to become necessary to hold them because of the size. Because procedurally generated games are fairly small, but create huge, massive universes. Whereas the games being made then were fairly small universes, but massive game files. So we have the procedurally generated Daggerfall, and it came to the party when Quake, Doom, Unreal were dominating everything. So it never got talked about. They were talking about Quake, they were talking about Unreal, they were talking about everything but Daggerfall. It wasn't until games started to appear that it made this 3D world a little bit more interesting. Like Unreal started introducing game types, so did Quake. You had Tribes, you had Operation Flashpoint, and these. And suddenly people started realizing you could do more with these games, more with these 3D worlds. And then Morrowind came. Right, Morrowind came in that era when all of this talk was going on, and they proved RPGs in a 3D world could work and work really well. So from about 92 to 2011, a 9 year period, or 2002, sorry, to 2011, that's the period between Morrowind being made and Skyrim being made. It's about 9 years. That was the heyday of the RPG market as we know it today. The period made by Bethesda, the Elder Scrolls games, ended in 2011. At that point, a new pressure was taking off. I mean, the internet was young back in the 90s, and there was. I used to say everybody on the internet's called Andy, and as a student, because everybody I met on RRC, FAD, and whatever seemed to be called Andy, and were a student. It's just the way it was. But around about 96, they started getting more people online, and then packages, to make it cheaper to surf the net came out. And then it wasn't until the noughties that people started taking the internet seriously. Your mobile phones were coming out, technology was changing. And from that point on, it became an internet thing. I mean, we were playing multiplayer games in the 90s, usually over a LAN. Late 90s, I was playing them on LAN. Into the noughties, they were becoming really popular. It was just a matter of time before somebody took the idea of an RPG and stuck it online and made it into an MMO. And the pressure when Skyrim came out to make an MMO was huge, absolutely huge. The Elder Scrolls, Fallout, they wanted to make that into a thing. The model there for macro managing the pennies, this was a much more profitable model than making a 3D RPG game. So they went down that road. And that point was at the point when the single player RPG game seemed to end and the RPG online started. And we've been waiting now for 11 years for the next Elder Scrolls game. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but from 1994 to 2011, that was the period when the Elder Scrolls single player games were made. And then it ended in 2011. And now we've had about 10 years or 11 years of MMOs. And now they're ending. The word is the number of players is dropping off now. People are walking away and thinking these are old games or I want something new. And people are turning back to the single player things like Starfield and things like that. So it's coming full circle again. But market forces are always there to determine what games come out, what games get made. It has very little to do with us and our demand and more to do with pennies and what will make something sellable. We saw it with the Voodoo games, the 3D games in the mid-90s, and how that changed the gaming scene. Because if it wasn't 3D, it just didn't get made. We saw it with Morrowind, when RPGs were starting to mature and becoming king. You couldn't go anywhere without hearing people talk about Morrowind. That went on for years. I didn't actually buy it until I actually got Oblivion, and then I went back and bought Morrowind. But Morrowind was always being talked about. Long before it was ported across to anything, it was being talked about. It was a classic game before Oblivion was even released. And you can tell a classic game because people don't stop talking about it. So now we face the first RPG game in a long time next year from Starfield. Hopefully the next Elder Scrolls game after that. But don't be surprised if market forces change things again and make things a bit different next time. I'm not sure what they are because development seems to have slowed down since the consoles have become the primary development platform. On the PC and on the MIGI, there were constantly new technologies being developed, new control methods. Everything was changing all the time. Every couple of years, it was really difficult to keep up if you're on a budget. Now technology slowed down. It's much more slower. It's generation to generation console style now. And that's how things develop. You have about 5 years between major changes. They were trying to push 3D, if you recall, not so long back. It's still being pushed to a degree. Don't be surprised if some breakthrough in that market makes technology cheaper and opens that door so all future RPGs are in 3D. In which case, the virtual reality games we see today, they're your Daggerfalls. They're the start of it. See you in the next one.